On March 25th, 1911, a fire broke out in the Triangle Shirtwaist factory building in Lower Manhattan. This was a sweatshop, more or less, a sweatshop that employed mostly immigrant women in the manufacturing and the assembling of shirtwaists, which are essentially undergarments. In the building, there were no fire escapes, and to encourage the women to work even harder, the managers locked the exit doors. So this fire that raged throughout the building trapped hundreds of working women, immigrant working women. They were unable to exit the building because of the blocked passages and for the exemption of fire escapes. And so, what many resorted to do, those who were not killed by the smoke inhalation, jumped to their deaths from windows about 20 stories up. So they thought that killing themselves would be better fate than dying and being consumed by flames. So this is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which kind of ignited, no pun intended, the Progressive Era movement. So in this lecture, we'll be talking about the Progressive Era as a kind of broad-based efflorescence of social activism in America that's directly responding to the inequitable urban development in America on the back and the foundation of the industrial era. So throughout this lecture, we'll be talking about the growth of cities in America and the way in which that also mirrors the industrializing era, but also augments the progressive era and augments the progressive initiatives and movements within that time frame. We're also talking about immigration, wealth and poverty in those urban areas as well, and how that corresponds to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And then we'll transition to the politics of progressivism specifically, and talking about the different manifestations of progressivism, that being economic justice, gender justice, and racial justice. We'll see the ways in which the progressive movement changes and is twisted by political establishments over time. So to begin this conversation, when you really talk about cities, and one of the best ways to talk about the growths of cities during this time is to talk about the development of New York City in particular. The area known today as Times Square long ago used to be called Long Acre Square. And the primary industry in Long Acre Square in the 19th century was not theater, it was not restaurants, it was not commercial ventures, it was not advertising, but rather it was horses. Long Acre Square was several rows of horse stables that housed all of the different horses that provided transportation for people in New York City. So we see in this postcard of Long Acre Square in 1911 trolleys. Trolleys, these are particularly electric motivated trolleys. So they're running on tracks that are actually electrocuted, and that's what gives them the power. But before the electrification of New York City and cities around the country, it was primarily horse-driven transportation throughout the city. So these same trolleys supposedly would have been harnessed with horses that would pull them throughout the streets. Same thing with delivery trucks. Same thing with carriages delivering passengers. Everything was horse-drawn transportation until the development of electrical power in urban areas. So that's important to know because it marks the exponential transformation of urban areas like Times Square. So during this late 19th century, American cities boomed in size, like New York City and Long Acre Square in particular. For example, Chicago doubled to take the second rank behind New York City. Brooklyn grew by 40%. So by the end of the 19th century, these 5 distinct boroughs, which were autonomous municipalities unto themselves, by the end of the 19th century had consolidated in one giant municipality, the Greater Consolidated New York City. So urban transportation had grown. Things like streetcars have been implemented, elevated trains, which we'll see a little bit. Subways were some of the first subways implemented in the United States were in New York City and Boston. Also expedited the transportation of people throughout the United States and throughout these urban areas. And overall, urban density flourished. So that means you have the increased size and height of urban buildings during this time. overwhelmingly, the size of cities. By 1860, Chicago was only 17 square miles, large. By 1900, that size had increased to 190 square miles. And we see the similar in Boston. So in 1860, at the breakout of the Civil War, Boston was only 5 square miles in circumference. By 1900, Boston had reached about 40 square miles in circumference. You can see the development of cities throughout this time is really remarkable in terms of the size and geographical spread of the city, but also in the vertical density as well when you talk about the development of skyscrapers. So during this time from 1860 to 1900, we see the development of distinct forms of urban utilities and services. Things like the first uniform police force in the United States was implemented in 1845 in New York City. So up until that time, you didn't have police forces. Okay. In 1871, major cities incorporated paid professional firefighters. Okay, 1871. So you may ask yourself, how did cities fight fires like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire before there were uniformed firefighters? Well, the answer is the fires were fought by independent fire clubs, basically volunteer fire clubs that would band together and fight fires on a case-by-case basis. Now, because they're not government entities or public entities, this bred quite a bit of corruption within these private clubs. Also during this time, this is cities like New York is where many of the industrialists like J.P. Morgan, like Vanderbilt, like Carnegie, like Frick, who was managing one of Carnegie's Homestead factories, all concentrated their businesses in the financial aspects of their businesses and their homes in these major cities. So, for example, in Madison Avenue around 37th Street is where J.P. Morgan's house, where J.P. Morgan resided. Similarly, on Fifth Avenue. In fact, all throughout Fifth Avenue, we see an array of mansions that belong to these wealthy industrialists by the end of the 19th century. So by the 1900s, we see urban areas begin to reflect this massive amount of wealth that's been generated in the country since the end of the Civil War. However, we also start to see the massive amount of poverty which comes along with it. So this is also on Fifth Avenue. So before that was Andrew Carnegie's mansion, and right down the street, one of Carnegie's managers, Henry Clay Frick, also has a mansion. Now it's interesting to think that all of these mansions, the Frick mansion, the Carnegie mansion, the Morgan mansion, the Vanderbilt mansion, are all still standing today. However, most of them are now museums. For example, the J.P. Morgan Library is a robust museum in Midtown Manhattan. Same thing with Andrew Carnegie. In the Upper East Side is the Smithsonian Institute's Cooper Hewitt Museum of Design is there. It's a really quite interesting layout if you haven't been there yet. Similarly, Henry Clay Frick's mansion in the 60s on Fifth Avenue is also a private, it stores his private collection, is now a museum open to the public. So at this time, we see also a huge number of immigrants coming to America during this time. So the first wave of immigrants, as we talked about, is primarily from the UK, but over time, the massive amounts of immigration coming to New York specifically, and many of the major industrializing centers of America are increasingly coming from Central Europe and Southern Europe. And these are primarily poor people looking for better opportunities for their lives, but also other people that have been ostracized and essentially exiled from their home country. For example, Jewish people who have been pushed out of Eastern Europe by pogroms, or essentially forms of genocide perpetrated on the Jewish people in Eastern Europe. So during this time, all these different immigrants are contributing to the affluence and the diversity of urban areas like New York City. So except with the huge exception, however, with Asian immigrants, because as we talked about in the last section, Asian immigrants by this time are extremely discriminated against in the United States. And this is manifested in two forms of legislation. For example, the Chinese Immigration Exclusion Act in 1882 and the Johnson Quota Act of 1924, one explicitly barring Chinese immigrants, other placing a racialized quota system on America's immigration policy. The living conditions for many of these immigrant families were quite poor in the early 1900s. So many of them lived in crowded, unsanitary dwellings that later became recognized by people like Jacob Riis as tenements. So what are tenements? Jacob Riis is kind of a very interesting progressive era activist during this time because he uses the medium of photography and writing to highlight a lot of the issues that he's seeing in urban areas like New York City. So in How the Other Half Lives, published in 1890, he documents a lot of this abject poverty. So he goes around New York City interviewing several 100,000 of these immigrants coming, primarily beggars, unemployed people, unwashed, malnourished. So he finds that about 3/4 of New York City's population lives in what he finds are called colloquially tenements. Okay, so tenements are multifamily apartment buildings that are often unsafe and unsanitary and overcrowded. And what he finds, and this is a diagram of a tenement from 1863. So what he finds in these tenements is that normally these are single-family townhouses that have been subdivided by the landlords in order to maximize the amount of rent that the landlord can garner from his tenants, primarily focusing on the poor tenants, mostly immigrants, like this Jewish cobbler, Ready for Sabbath, and a coal cellar. So he's living in a coal cellar. So if you don't know what a coal cellar is, essentially it's a basement where you throw all the coal. There's no door except a chute that comes down and it protrudes from the outside. So someone's selling coal, you buy coal from your window, and they say, okay, open up your chute. So you open up your chute, and he throws a bunch of coal down into the basement. Well, this is where this guy, this Jewish cobbler, was living. This is where he's paying rent. Similarly here in the sleeping quarters in Rivington Street Dump. So he's living actually in a dump, and you can see a pair of feet protruding from his ceiling. So you can tell that it's not a very safe environment, especially for young children, but also it's not a very sanitary environment as well. Within these tenements also, we have to keep in mind there's another aspect of tenements that Jacob Riis highlights, and he calls them hotbeds. So let me see if I have a picture. Hotbeds get their name from very exploitative practices from landlords. So basically what a hotbed is it's one bed like this one here, this gentleman's sitting on his bed, and basically it's called a hotbed because it's always hot. So presumably this man might rent this bed for 6 hours, and after sleeping for 6 hours, go to work for 6 hours, or even probably longer than that. And while he's at work, someone else would rent the bed, like this person, rent it for another 6 hours. So at any given time, in one day, 3 people can be sleeping in one bed. That's why it remained hot. Their body heat kept those beds hot. However, because of many of the poor people lack the plumbing facilities and the washing facilities to maintain proper hygiene, a lot of these beds were completely unsanitary, which contributed to the spread of disease throughout these tenements, which is very, very important to keep in mind. So Jacob Riis is critiquing not only the abject poverty, but he's highlighting public health concerns within these areas of concentrated poverty. So he says 4 families occupy each floor, and sets of rooms consist of 1 or 2 dark closets. And dark closets are these rooms indicated with D. And these mean that these dark closets have no windows. And oftentimes these are bedrooms. So these are bedrooms with no windows. So they're usually about 12 by 10 feet. Okay. The staircase is often dark in the center of the house, and no direct ventilation is possible. Okay, so he's highlighting some of the public safety and public health concerns of tenements. There's no light and there's no ventilation. And without light or ventilation, that breeds germs and spreads disease very quickly. And so over time, people die off in these tenements, become death traps, not to mention fire traps as well. There's no fire safety, there's no regulation whatsoever on public tenements like these. Okay, so through his work as a journalist, a photojournalist, and through this publication, How the Other Half Lives, Jacob Riis is able to change legislative policy so that by, at least in New York State, by 1901, you have what's called the tenement law, which requires all new buildings to at least have some form of ventilation for each domicile, but also at least one window per house. Okay, and that actually creates a distinct type of architecture in New York City based on this legislation, which is prompted by Jacob Riis's activism during this time. Okay, so here are some other some of his other photos from that publication documenting some of the abject poverty during this time. Jacob Riis gets some flack, as do other early photographers from this era, because one of the ways in which he orchestrates many of his photos and designs some of his photos is that he pays the subjects to stand in place, primarily because of the limitations of photography during this time. So it may look like these children are sleeping in the gutter when in fact they are actually just closing their eyes. So that's some flack that he gets. But nonetheless, overall, his publication and his photographs document some of the abject poverty that was taking place, not just in New York City, but around the country in general. Okay. So once in the United States, many immigrants found themselves, or they would be lucky actually, to find work in industrialized manufacturing centers like those created by Ford. But what Ford does is quite revolutionary for his time. Kind of like the corporate models that Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and John D. Rockefeller designed, Ford designs a specific corporate model to accommodate those poor immigrants coming to the United States looking for jobs. And he develops this concept of Fordism. So by 1908, Henry Ford becomes wildly famous for creating the Ford Model T. Up until this time, automobiles, personal automobiles, are exclusively, prohibitively expensive, exclusively for wealthy clients and wealthy consumers. However, with the development of the Ford Model T, that kind of changes the game, because he finally makes an affordable style of personal automobile that can be marketed to a broader audience, not just the super wealthy like J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie, but rather for at least like the upper middle class consumers. Now, people like the Jewish cobbler who's sleeping in the coal cellar most likely could not afford a Model T, for example, but nonetheless, Henry Ford does expand the consumer base for personal automobiles. And he does this through and some of Andrew Carnegie's principles, which is finding cheap materials, finding cheap labor, producing a cheaper product for your consumer. However, he also does this by implementing a corporate model he calls Fordism. So, what is Fordism? Fordism is a philosophy of manufacturing that implements that promotes hard work among its employees, but rewarding that hard work with good pay. So workers would be able to consume the products that they manufacture themselves. Okay, so that's really important. So not only is Henry Ford producing products to appeal to a broader consumer base, but in fact, he's producing products that can be consumed by his own producers, but by his own workers, his employees. And that's why Henry Ford is able to make so much money and create a large empire. And that's how ultimately by 1928, he's able to create his own colony in Brazil, Fordlandia. So as economic production shifted from capital goods, steel equipment, for example, to consumer products, the new advertising industry perfected ways of increasing sales, often by linking goods with this idea of freedom. And this is exactly what Henry Ford was designing here with this Ford Model T. is that, okay, this automobile affords you, no pun intended, a sense of freedom by the way in which you can move freely throughout the country by traveling very quickly on this Model T. Because of this time, as I said, mostly personal transportation was conducted via horses, right? So with this Model T, you can just start up the engine and go wherever you want. You don't have to worry about feeding a horse, stabling a horse, or anything like that. This is a mechanical horse that would definitely provide a certain degree of freedom for those that had a Model T, for example. And this is how he marketed his items, right? So this is how he marketed Model T and how it became so popular during this time. So the maturation of the consumer economy gave rise to concepts like the living wage, right? There has to be a living wage, meaning that I have to get enough money from working, whatever job I'm working. I have to get enough money to provide for the basic necessities of my life. And this is a new concept that's developing. So there's the living wage and there's also a standard of living. And these are new concepts that activists later on turn to and rallying for social change. Okay, so with this new language, this becomes a new language for criticizing the inequities of wealth and poverty during the Progressive Era America. So the popularity of the idea of an American standard and living wage reflected in part the emergence of a mass consumer society. For the first time in the nation's history, mass consumption came to occupy a central place in descriptions of American society and its future. And this is remarkable, but also provides a foil through which we can read a lot of the Progressive Era activism, like gender justice during this time. So on the coattails of all this economic and technological transformation, also the roles of women and gender roles broadly are changing wildly over this time. And this is reflected in the amount of women that are now going to college, to higher education. So to give you some example, in 1870, 1 out of 7 college grads were women. Okay, 1 out of 7. By 1900, however, 1 out of 4 college grads were women. So we can see the number of college-educated women, the educated female populations increase over time. And this accounts for a lot of the gender justice activism that we see during this time. One of the most notable female activists during this time, his name is Jane Addams. So Jane Addams had a particular type of activism, a particular way of criticizing urban poverty because she felt that urban poverty was inherently predicated on your socially prescribed gender roles. Okay, so basically what Jane Addams did is she created these settlement houses, she called them, and essentially what they were community centers where she can educate women and provide free services for women, including nursery for children, kindergarten classes for children, classes for women on raising your children, educating your children, as well as playgrounds for those children and exercise facilities for those single women. So in addition to providing these vital services for single women in particular, settlement houses like the Hull House in Chicago were also centers of political activism. So they were classrooms, but they were also community centers where activists came together to challenge political local machines and corruption, to seek cleaner streets, to fight for child abortion. So this is something that people like Margaret Sanger and other activists fought for because she felt that abortion should be a woman's right, even early on as this is. Abortion should be a woman's right, and that it's part of her rights as a citizen. And this is what they're all fighting for. Jane Addams, we'll get to Emma Goldman in a second, is that they're fighting for female citizenship, to expand the boundaries of citizenship to include women. Because up in this time, women are still relegated very much to the domestic sphere, meaning that their socially prescribed gender roles pertain mostly to child rearing, taking care of the house, and taking care of the breadwinning man, so to speak. And a lot of this was changing. The boundaries of citizenship were expanding via the activism of people like Jane Addams, Margaret Sanger, and Emma Goldman. They were transforming these gender roles on top of the economic and technological transformations during this time. So Margaret Sanger is an advocate for birth control and reproductive rights, whereas Emma Goldman espouses many of these initiatives triggered by Jane Addams and Margaret Sanger. However, Emma Goldman's primary influence here is as an activist, a communist and anarchist activist, in which she's trying to directly engage with the American political sphere. Throughout the 19th century, most Americans defined women's roles as those of a wife, a mother, a guardian of the family, responsibility for its moral, spiritual, and physical well-being. And these women, these activists, lead the charge in transforming this and expanding civil rights to women to ultimately the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote. We're going to transition now to racial justice because this is also a critical issue during this time. So we've already talked about during the Reconstruction era the way in which Americans reconfigured the boundaries of citizenship so to subjugate and exploit Black Americans throughout the South, but also in the North as well. And so with the advances of the economy and the advances of the consumer society, this also triggered activism in terms of racial justice. So we should say that racial justice was not popular among many of the official progressive era political candidates. Okay? Only a few white progressives actively opposed disenfranchisement and segregation in the South. Indeed, Southern white progressives often took the lead in enacting discriminatory laws, like those Jim Crow laws that we talked about. In addition to this, one of the rallying cries and one of the motivators behind Black activism during this time was of the explosion of lynchings in America since the Civil War. So lynchings are essentially public acts of murder. Lynchings are state violence because they're state sanctioned, particularly in the South. And so there's an explosion of lynchings that takes place at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century as well. So between 1900 and 1917, lynchings killed more than 1,100 blacks in the South and Midwest, triggering a number of race riots throughout the country. Black activists speaking out against these lynchings. But there are three individuals in particular that really take the lead in terms of anti-lynching legislation and black citizenship generally. And these are W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and Marcus Garvey. So we'll be covering them specifically as we go down. There are few Americans that epitomize this concept of Renaissance man, as does W.E.B. Du Bois. He does everything, and he's the first in revolutionizing many, many different things. So, for example, he's the first Black American to receive a PhD from Harvard. And he wrote some of the first scholarly investigations into Black American culture and experience. Okay, so one of the first things he writes about is about Black Reconstruction, about that efflorescence of Black votership after the Civil War that's quickly repressed by state violence and by the KKK, quickly repressed. However, a lot of that is overwritten and not remembered in American society. So this is his first initiative to recover some of those stories and to write about it and interpret it. Why does this happen? Why does this happen? And he pinpoints it to this idea of the color line, that there's a dividing line in American culture that's based on race. So once he achieves his PhD from Harvard, he then founds the discipline of sociology in the United States with a concentrated focus on Black poverty in Philadelphia. With a publication called The Philadelphia Negro. But then he takes his expertise as an academic and applies it to the political arena. So in 1910, he and other Black activists found the National Association for the Advancement of the Colored People, NAACP as it were. So this is a racially integrated civil rights organization founded in New York City, and it continues as a spearhead to end racial discrimination and expand Black citizenship in the United States. Ida B. Wells is a little bit different. She is rather a journalist working in the American South during the end of the 19th century. And her journalism is specifically focusing on examples of anti-Black lynching in the United States. So up until this time, a lot of the lynching that was taking place around the country was not reported, right? And that's what enabled it to proliferate and that's for it. So part of Ida B. Wells' activism has to do with the way in which she's writing about lynching and publicizing the fact that people are being lynched, that there's actually a genocide taking place in the United States and people don't even know about it. So that's how she's taking place. She travels to teach in Mississippi, rural Mississippi. She authors a number of books as well as publications documenting this lynching. Through her publications, she argues that lynching is a way in which white supremacy is able to maintain its dominance over non-white Americans. Marcus Garvey is a little bit different than W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, partly because he's a Caribbean immigrant. And he is pursuing black civil rights and social justice, but in a very different way. So Marcus Garvey founds the Black Star Line in direct opposition to the famous White Star Line. And we know the White Star Line most infamously in the example of the Titanic, which sank in the early 20th century. So the Black Star Line is this cruise ship line that Marcus Garvey founds with the direct goal of removing black people from the United States and bringing them to black countries like those countries in the Caribbean, or bringing them back to Africa. And I think that Marcus Garvey really represents a different style of black activism, a different tradition of black activism when compared with W.E. Du Bois, and that is a kind of separatist tradition. So we see as early as the abolitionist movement starts in the late 1700s, we see an impulse of separatism, of recolonizing Africa with the mission of bringing freed slaves from the United States back to Africa and establishing an autonomous society. Marcus Garvey, in a very strong way, is continuing this tradition of separatism that we're going to see again emerge in the 1960s and 1970s with the Black Power movement. But that's a lot different than W.E.B. Du Bois, which he's not very much a separatist, but he's also not an integrationist in the way that Booker T. Washington, for example, is. But nonetheless, they represent two different types of political traditions. So in the context of Fordism, in context of immigration, in the context of the massive disparity of wealth and poverty, we could get to kind of make sense of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. In a historical context, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was one of the deadliest industrial disasters in the history of New York City and the history of the United States. The fire caused the deaths of 150 garment workers. 123 of those were women, and only a few of them were men who died from the fire, from smoke inhalation, or just many of them jumped from the window to kill themselves. And we have to keep in mind that this is not an isolated incident, that examples like this were happening all throughout the United States. Just a few years before, there was another huge factory fire in a glass factory in Newark, New Jersey, in which 25 women were killed. But the similar circumstances were that there were no fire escapes. There were the exits were locked because the managers wanted the workers to work harder. Okay, so the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire became the rallying cry for many progressive activists to call for more regulation in terms of building codes, to call for more workers' rights, to call for more rights for immigrants, to call for more women's rights, because the majority of these people working in here were definitely women. So the fire led to legislation requiring improved factory safety standards and helped spur the growth of many unions, like the female-led International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which fought for better working conditions for sweatshop workers like those in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Most of all, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire revealed more and more that women still were working for very, very small wages. So overall, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory really pinpoints a lot of the activist causes and the activist initiatives that many of the progressive legislatures and activists during this time were pushing for. Progressives on the national stage. So up until the election of 1912, progressivism was primarily a disparate collection of various activists, like those advocating for racial justice or gender justice or economic justice. But up until the 1912 election, there was no specific political candidate championing any one of those activist pursuits. Okay, so in 1901, President William McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist dissident. I'm leaving Theodore Roosevelt to assume the presidency. So immediately, Teddy Roosevelt sought to check unfettered power of American industries with the passage of very specific legislation to break down a lot of the corporate subsidies and the corporate benefits that many corporations were getting from the government during this time. So if any one of these candidates were considered a progressive candidate from the early on, it would have been Teddy Roosevelt. So, for example, in 1901, Teddy Roosevelt targets the Morganization of corporations, and he attempts to break down a lot of these monopolies that have emerged by the end of the 19th century, like those of Morgan's corporations that he owns. Remember all the tentacles in that he has his hands on all these different industries. Teddy Roosevelt is attempting to break that down because he realizes the disproportionate impact that kind of corporate structure has on its workers. And for the most part, Teddy Roosevelt's administration carries on the very similar kinds of imperialistic policies that we saw under McKinley. And it isn't until the election of 1912 that we see Teddy Roosevelt's platform and his power as a presidential candidate really contested. So the presidential election of 1912 is really an interesting election because it's the first time in which there are three viable political candidates running for office. We have Theodore Roosevelt, who's a progressive, and Theodore Roosevelt at this time reforms the Progressive Party, which at that time was splintered by forming his own Bull Moose Party. So Bull Moose being this kind of splintered group of the Progressive Party. William Howard Taft, his running mate early on, broke off and after serving as a military governor of the Philippines, ran for the Republican candidate for this election. Woodrow Wilson, who declared himself as a progressive, now at this point in 1912 runs as a Democrat. We also have Eugene Debs, who at this time is the socialist candidate. And I think even though he's not featured in the diagram here, he represents the multiplicity of political ideologies, viable political ideologies from this time. And it's one of the only times that we have an actually Socialist Party candidate running for, a viable candidate running for presidential election. In the outcome of the presidential election, Wilson won the majority of the Democratic vote. He won the popular vote by 40%. Roosevelt won by 20. Roosevelt won 27%, which split the Republican vote with Taft. Taft only won 23%, and Eugene Debs won 7%. We're going to see Eugene Debs a little bit later when he is arrested for his political activism. He runs for office from prison. One of the things before we move on to the Woodrow Wilson's administration is that Teddy Roosevelt founds this Bull Moose Party, effectively splintering the Progressive Party, but creates this slogan called "a square deal all around," meaning that he's advocating for the immigrants. He's advocating for the less empowered people in the United States. He wants a square deal for them, just as the industrialists like Carnegie and Morgan are also getting a deal as well. So we're going to see this slogan reinterpreted by a distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt's in Franklin Roosevelt's administration in the 1930s, the late 1930s. But moving on to the Woodrow Wilson's administration, we really see the way in which moving on to Woodrow Wilson's administration, we see very explicitly a white Southerner in the Oval Office. So Woodrow Wilson, just to give you some backstory, is a highly intellectual candidate. He has his PhD from Johns Hopkins University. He becomes a president professor and then president of Princeton University, and eventually is elected governor of New Jersey in 1910. However, as an aristocratic white Southerner, he brings with him many of the Jim Crow policies that he grew up with in the South. So, in a way, we can see that Wilson really brings Jim Crow to the federal level. So, as soon as he sits in office, one of his first acts as president is to segregate federal employees. So that means firing all the black employees in the White House and the federal level employees, and appointing primarily white men in those offices. So he never reversed his policy decision, but slowly stopped segregating the federal offices. It's also remarkable at this time that Woodrow Wilson screens a number of racist films in the White House during this time, like The Birth of the Nation. So The Birth of the Nation is a very particular film, very important in American political culture, because it retells the story of Reconstruction with white supremacists and the KKK as the heroes of humanity, the heroes of white masculinity. So in the story, the Reconstruction appoints and elects a number of black politicians to the office. However, in the film, the black politicians are featured as people that are perpetrating violence on white women and white children and raping white women. So it's up to heroes of the KKK to save white people from the black legislators that have been dominating the Southern government. In the film, Woodrow Wilson is actually quoted by D.W. Griffith when he says, "The white men were roused by the mere instinct of self-preservation, until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a venerable empire of the South, to protect this Southern country." So Birth of the Nation is really glorifying these domestic terrorists, the Ku Klux Klan, and it's getting an endorsement from the President of the United States, which, as we saw with the explosion of lynchings after Reconstruction, is making it more permissible for racial intolerance and racial violence to flood the American South and the parts of the North as well. So it's giving white Southerners, making them feel that it's okay, that the president has our back, that he feels the same way, that we're going to continue to perpetrate this racial violence in America. And in fact, there's a refounding of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1920s, and we've seen this already in a former slide, on top of a giant stone hill, like that Stone Mountain in Georgia. That's where the Ku Klux Klan is refounded in the 1920s. And that's when they carved those Confederate memorials into that giant open-face block of granite. Okay, so the progressive movement dies out in the World War I, and that's the next lecture we're going to get to, because the war effort really diverted attention from a lot of the social reform and political reform that the progressives were pushing for. However, the progressive movement succeeded by inserting the federal government as a vital force in the United States economy. There was finally some checks and balances in terms of the unfettered amount of growth corporations experienced during this time because of the corruption with the United States government. They were also successful in regulating a wide range of economic activity and enforcing laws to protect consumers and workers, like the tenement law that Jacob Riis helped pass, or like many of the legislation that came out of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. A lot of these things maintain their prominence in American law and society up until. So we didn't really touch on muckrakers, but we'll discuss them in discussion section. But I want you to be aware of what Fordism is and how it relates to the progressive era. What is a tenement? Who is W.E.B. Du Bois? He's a huge figure in American history. We're going to see actually later in the 1960s, he's not only a role model for many black activists, but actually he's a role model for diplomacy. He goes over to China and meets with the communist premier Mao Zedong. What is Longacre Square? Who is Marcus Garvey? Who is Ida B. Wells? Who is Jane Addams? What is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory? And there are others, but I think we'll discuss them in discussion section.